Monitoring Hyper-V in the cloud. Approaches in monitoring VMs you don't directly control. Hey, my name is Greg Shields, and I'm an MVP and also a V-expert. I am also a senior partner and principal technologist with Concentrated Technology. That's concentratedtech.com. And I want to thank Five9, our sponsor for this webinar, for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today about a problem that I think plagues a lot of administrators who are contemplating cloud hosting for some of their virtual machines. And that real problem is just how do you monitor those virtual machines once they're up on somebody else's infrastructure? You know, once I've eliminated the direct control of my virtual machine, well, what kind of tools and tactics are available so that I can continuously recognize that my provider is giving me the levels of service that they've told me that they want to give? And that's kind of the topic. That's kind of one of the things that I want to spend some time exploring with you over the next few minutes, helping you understand that there are actually some approaches in monitoring VMs. And I'm going to talk about the approaches, and a little later we're going to talk about some of the products. About how you might actually control those VMs once you give away the control of their actual processing. I've spent a lot of time over the last year or so talking with a lot of IT professionals about the whole notion of cloud. And almost universally, that whole cloud thing it's really got under the skin, I think, of a lot of IT professionals. And the notion of control is, I think, one of the reasons why most IT pros kind of itch a little funny when you start to push cloud onto them. And part of the reason is that IT professionals have for a very long period of time been used to being the service provider. Right? IT provided a service to the business, and the IT professionals in that business were the ones that were actually doing the service providing. And so offloading those services onto somebody else goes kind of counter to what we have sort of grown up with in IT over the years. Part of that is because, as you can see here on the screen, monitoring local assets, so monitoring the assets that we own, is relatively easy. Right? Notwithstanding the operating system and the applications, when I have virtual machines that are inside of my own data center, I control the hypervisor. Right? I control the virtual machines because, well, they're on my hardware. In order to get to them, I've got to get through some door lock to get into the data center. I also control the networking infrastructure and also the monitoring infrastructure for all the pieces that sit underneath that monitor. And so this whole concept of local assets is easy for us to wrap our arms around because we've been doing it forever. But when we take this and extend it out of our local environment into the cloud, is when a lot of people, like I said, they get a little, the itch just a little bit funny about that. I hopefully over the next few minutes will give you an understanding about how you can feel a little bit better and rest a little more comfortable at night in the whole idea of doing things. So let's assume that you have created a private cloud of virtual machines, and that private cloud runs just whatever virtual machines you've put into it. Right? It's set up for load balancing. It's set up for failure, for failover. And so you know that if you create a virtual machine, you've got a set of resources. That virtual machine will consume those resources, and so you have this nice, easily understandable private cloud. Now, in a private cloud scenario, all of the assets in that private cloud, all of the physical resources that you're applying to virtual machines, well, they remain within your control. So in the private cloud scenario, it's really no different than the physical world because private cloud is easy to understand. I own everything. It's when we start taking those virtual machines out of the private cloud and moving them into someone else's cloud, right, into the public cloud, that things start to get a little bit more difficult. So I say here, monitoring non-local assets is hard, right? So you control the virtual machines, right? If you go and you buy or rent some space from Amazon or from Rackspace or from hosting.com or whoever it is that would be your virtual machine provider, you're going to control the VMs. They're not going to have access to the VMs, at least one hopes not. But you're not going to control the hypervisor. right? You're not going to have access to make hypervisor changes. You're going to get a management interface that allows you to perform actions on your VMs, but not the hypervisor layer. And while you can control your own network settings, you're not going to control the networking infrastructure. You also don't control the monitoring infrastructure. Right? You're on top of somebody else's equipment, and so it's their monitors that are going to provide the instrumentation of the data for you. They may give you a view to those monitors, but you don't control that. You're just viewing the information that they contain. So in the public cloud, in many ways, you're kind of stuck with the solutions your provider offers. Well, at least in the early public cloud, this is sort of the case. You know, who was it that said trust but verify? I think that was one of our former U.S. presidents once said trust but verify. And the whole idea of trusting your public cloud provider, but also verifying their actions, ensures that you're getting the correct level of service that your SLA says that you should be getting. You've got to actually have some sort of monitoring to support that verification. Right? So we want to trust them, but we need to verify them. Well, if I don't have monitoring, how do I validate that my VMs are healthy? Okay, that they have the right patch infrastructure, that they are firewalled appropriately, not only so that my data doesn't get out, but so other people's data doesn't get in. How do I recognize when a virtual machine goes down? Right? Do I rely on a simple ping, or do I want something a little bit more complex than that? How do I pay attention to the traffic patterns that are going on in and out of that virtual machine? And not only out of that virtual machine and out of the public cloud, but out of that virtual machine to other VMs on the same host, so intra-VM traffic. How do I assure security? And thus that my provider is meeting the terms of our agreement. Here I note that compliance, it means regulatory and industry compliance, but it also means compliance with whatever paperwork you sign with that provider. So you've agreed or they've agreed that they'll provide a certain set of services. You need to assure that those services are running. Obviously, performance is important as well. If your virtual machine is not running fast today, well, how do you ensure that you can tell them that there's something going wrong? And then also, how do you collect data for capacity planning? Anytime we extend our private cloud into the public cloud, capacity planning becomes a fundamentally important idea. At the end of the day, we have to recognize that what you are paying for, or what you need, is equal to what you're getting. And doing so via a unified tool set obviously is probably a really good idea. Okay, if I need multiple tools in order to support that, that's probably not the best solution. So let's hone down on those three words. What do you need? Right? So in this world of, I have a private cloud with some VMs that I control, and then the public cloud with some other VMs that somebody else controls. What do I actually need to support these monitoring requirements? First and foremost is going to be the idea that host and guest monitoring functionality that doesn't impact performance. Okay, I can run a monitor, and there are many of them out there, that you turn them on, and the amount of resources that is required in order to support just the running of that monitor is greater than the efficacy of the data that I'm getting out of it. Right? So if I'm paying 5 or 10% of my processor utilization just to run the monitor, that's not a great idea, especially as I start co-locating those virtual machines onto somebody else's hosts. So whatever monitoring tools there are, they have to be well designed and very thin in terms of the performance and the resources that they require. I also need to have a verification at multiple layers of the stack for whatever services may be running on top of those machines. So I've got to know what ports are open and what those ports are actually listening for. And I have to understand also any WMI characteristics as well. So I may need to go in and dig into WMI and see if anything's changed. Recognizing that helps me understand if somebody's been doing something in there. I need to also recognize that whatever solution that I put into place needs to stand outside of the solutions that are being supplied by my provider. Okay, so the provider is going to give you some set of data. Okay, they're going to give you some nice web page that lets you know how well your machines are behaving, or hopefully they do. whatever solution that you use as the independent verification should not be dependent on that thing, right? The solution that you implement needs to have sort of an independent verification so that you know that they're providing whatever they need. I mean, in the worst possible scenario, the provider is actually giving you bad data. That solution also needs to have some programmatic exposure or script exposure. You know, I'm going to throw virtual machines out in the cloud somewhere. I want to be able to enact change on those VMs, and having the ability to enact change through some programmatic solution or script-based solution means that I can continuously make those changes, maybe even in a highly firewalled scenario. Okay, maybe I don't have those VMs completely connected into my internal network. Maybe they're on a DMZ somewhere. And so having that programmatic exposure, that script exposure, allows me to continue managing them just as if they were in my environment, but with all the necessary protections in place. Now, my virtual machines, so you go and, again, you rent some portion of a provider's environment, your virtual machines are actually going to be moving around that environment all the time. Right? And so whatever portion that you've chopped off out of that environment is not necessarily always going to be on the same host. In fact, you wouldn't want it to be. If it did, a failure of that host would mean a failure of the virtual machine. So the tool that you have, the tool that you support, needs to be aware of any migrations, or at least be friendly enough to recognize when a virtual machine is in a cluster environment, is in a live migration scenario. That interface also needs to spread across all the hosts and virtual machines that you may have. Now, what's important to recognize here is that whatever solution you have as a monitor probably should interface with the VMs in the cloud, in the public cloud, as well as the hosts and VMs in your private cloud as well. So whatever user interface it ends up implementing needs to support all of the functionality of hosts, of VMs, of local, of remote. It also needs to be able to support multiple cluster and multiple data center management as well. And so I might have an internal cluster. I might stretch that cluster into the cloud. I might have two clusters, one inside and one outside. So whatever arrangement of virtual machine and host resources needs to be supportable in order to have that full single pane of glass for my monitoring solution. And then and this kind of goes without saying, but full exposure for all the virtual machine tasks. If I need to reboot a machine or perform some VM level task for it, it needs to be able to support that in order to be fully featured. Now, why do you need that? And I've kind of already alluded to this fact that the hosting architectures for Hyper-V are really evolving today. Right? The complexity of the Hyper-V arrangement is definitely increasing because whereas we used to have just a couple of Hyper-V hosts, and then maybe we created a cluster of them, and then we added a few more tools for live migration and failover, so we created this private cloud. And then the private cloud at some point needs to extend into the public cloud. The whole arrangement of the network has gotten quite a bit more complex, and so you need to have this monitoring solution that can go anywhere so that you can support, well, where might my data center have to extend into the future? So today I have whatever resources I need in my private cloud. Maybe your business acquires another business and you need to extend your private cloud to another private cloud, or you decide to go into a new line of business and you need to extend into the public cloud because you just can't get the resources in fast enough. So all of these are necessary so that you can support all of these different connected data center arrangements that may occur. When you have that solution, right, the different elements that would make up that solution, first of all, you want local control of the monitoring solution. This provides you the ability to take those local assets and the information that comprises those local assets, and then aggregate that with whatever stuff you have that's elsewhere into a single view. That view exists in your private cloud because that's where you want the local control of that private cloud. That local control leverages the exposed endpoints within the cloud service. Right? So your service provider has a certain set of endpoints that your tool, your monitoring tool, can actually reference to give you local control to enact change on those remote computers. And this is something that you want to be careful of whenever you're making the decisions about what sort of public cloud provider that you're going to choose. Eliminating the reliance on just simply those provider tools gives you a kind of out-of-band verification that your provider is indeed meeting their SLA. So if they end up having some sort of SLA problem, well, then you know, or some monitoring tool problem, you know that your monitoring tool is still working. So eliminating that provider reliance, secondary verification, and additional verification should something go amiss. The right solution today enables you to perform whatever administrative functions that you need on remote systems that are really no different than local systems. And this kind of introduces a very interesting point. A lot of people today, I mentioned having kind of this weird itchy feeling as it relates to cloud hosting of virtual machines. And the public cloud, I don't trust the public cloud because, well, a lot, at least as I see it, a lot of that distrust of public cloud probably stems from a misunderstanding that you could put a monitoring solution in place to verify that the provider's doing what they need to. Right? If it's hosted here or if it's hosted there, and if I have the monitoring solution in place that assures that they're not doing something funny, well, why should I really care if they're hosting or if I'm hosting it? I should select whatever makes sense for the workload and for the cost basis. So if you found that cloud really just itches you funny, think about what monitoring solutions are out there, because with the right monitors in place, it may not matter. The right monitor also has the ability to follow your virtual machines as they live migrate. You know, if I have an internal cluster that's stretched out to the external cluster, well, I need to be able to follow those VMs no matter where they're at. I also need to send commands or scripts or whatever code to those VMs no matter where they're at as well. I think I mentioned before about in the fully connected environment or in the heavily firewalled environment, having the ability to execute commands and scripts and other code to these computers becomes fundamentally important. I need to be able to manage them just like I would internal assets. So ultimately, monitoring those non-local assets doesn't really need to be difficult. Right? The itchiness that I think you and maybe a lot of other IT pros are feeling probably doesn't really need to be there if you have the right monitoring tools in place. Now, admittedly, you may control the VMs, but you don't control the hypervisor and you don't control the network infrastructure, but you can actually control the monitoring infrastructure. You can have local control. You can have the right endpoint exposure, the right remote endpoint exposure to enable complete administration and the complete assurance that your provider is accomplishing the things that you want them to provide. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of an introduction into some of the approaches that are available right now today to monitor Hyper-V in the cloud, and how when you take your virtual machines and you cede control of those virtual machines to that hosting provider, you can still retain a lot of the monitoring and configuration control that you really want for them inside of your own environment. At this point, I think I'm going to turn the presentation over to the next presenter, who's going to talk about some of the solutions that actually facilitate this to occur in the real world.